afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the League of Women Voters. Welcome to the League of Women Voters of Arizona webinar. New voting districts and your vote. We are really delighted you have joined us this afternoon to participate in this conversation with the experts. Before we begin this afternoon's program, some norms for today's event. The event will be recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, please remove yourself from the webinar. The links to the recording will be posted on the League of Women Voters Arizona YouTube channel in a couple of days. In order to ensure that we're able to review and present as many questions as asked during the event, we will not be utilizing the chat. All Q&A and comments will need to be submitted using the Q&A tool. If we are unable to get to a question, we will attempt to provide a response to the requester via email. Please be sure to locate and open the Q&A window and to follow the questions being asked. Welcome again. I am Pima Sharan, President-elect of the Arizona State League and the State Advocacy Chair. This event is supported by League members assisting to curate the questions in the Q&A and providing technical support. I'd like to give a huge thank you to Lynn Hudson of Greater Tucson, Dee Maitland of Greater Tucson, Barbara Rosenberg of Metro Phoenix, and Leslie Cox of Greater Tucson. Thank you so much, our League members, for being here to help us. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan, all-volunteer grassroots organization. We are nonpartisan in that we neither support nor oppose any candidates or political parties. That being said, the League is political and we stand strong in making democracy work and are firmly committed to our positions for good government, expanding the franchise for all citizens to participate, ensuring fair representation and redistricting, and advocating against the corrupting influence of money in politics. The League's Making Democracy Work campaign is to help fulfill the promise of democracy for all. League members are responding with increased energy and a sense of urgency that our very precious and fragile democracy is in peril. We are mobilized with resolve to fight the continued assault at restricting the participation of all eligible citizens in the franchise, creating of barriers to voting, and against any legislation to subvert the vote. On behalf of the League, we extend our full support for the work of our county elections departments, and their leaders are here today to help us understand what's in front of us with new districts. And we stand with them and are honored to be their partners in some of our work as they counter the misinformation and work to rebuild confidence in future elections. This is one of many webinars that the League is holding to educate the public and provide trusted information regarding elections and voting. We begin today's program with an overview from Betty Bankston, coordinator of the People-Powered Fair Maps Campaign Grant. This will be followed by a panel discussion and presentations by Mr. Jeremy Duda, Recorder Richard, Director Jarrett, and Recorder Casares Kelly, moderated by our own Betty Bankston. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you all Betty Bankston, who is a member of the League of Women Voters Advocacy Committee and chairs the League of Women Voters Greater Tucson Advocacy Committee. Betty has been leading our redistricting effort almost for 2 decades. She was very instrumental in doing a lot of testimony, not necessarily on behalf of the League, but she has kept an eye on redistricting for a while here in Arizona. And we're grateful for both her expertise and her leadership on this front. Redistricting is one of the major advocacy and action priorities for LWV, and Betty is coordinating our People-Powered Fair Maps campaign grant. She retired from a 33-year career as an academic librarian. Betty is the director emerita of the University of Washington Libraries. Thank you, Betty, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Penny. And let me add my welcome to yours, to everyone, to our speakers, and to all of our attendees today. As Penny said, the League has been monitoring the redistricting process in Arizona since late 2019. We became involved as calls were going out for applicants to be on the commission, and we have attended all of the public hearings and the business meetings of the IRC for the last year and a half. So why do we redistrict? Penny, I think you have my slides.
You want to introduce this before you jump into your slides? It might be helpful for everybody to know we have this work.
Okay, sure. I didn't realize we had this, but yes, this is a new information card that we have designed and we'll be distributing at various events throughout the state. It basically tells people we have new districts. They should be looking to see what are their new districts, check their voter registration, and make sure they are ready for the 2022 elections. And then, of course, they'll be hearing more this afternoon about getting ready and being prepared. So thank you. Yeah. So why do we redistrict? First, it's required by the U.S. Constitution every 10 years following the election. The basic purpose is to reapportion the 435 congressional seats among the states. So each state gets one seat, and then the remaining are apportioned among the state according to population. So rebalancing the population among districts so that there is approximately one person, one vote is the basic purpose of redistricting. In Arizona, we redistrict using an Independent Redistricting Commission, which was established in 2000 with passage of Proposition 106. It's an independent commission, meaning that it is independent of the legislature, of the governor, and it draws new maps, and those maps become the maps we use, unless, of course, they're challenged in a court case. But they don't have to be approved by the legislature. They don't have to be approved by the governor. The purpose of establishing this commission was to end gerrymandering, to improve voter and candidate participation, and to create fair and competitive districts, according to the ballot measure description from 2000. The Independent Redistricting Commission uses criteria that prescribed by the proposition to create the maps. The maps must comply with the U.S. Constitution and the Voting Rights Act. They must have equal population. If you could advance the slides, Penny. And the congressional districts cannot vary in population more than plus or minus one person. So that's very precise work. And the legislative maps may vary by plus or minus 5% in population. The map criteria that were, in addition to equal population, to the extent practicable, our Arizona maps must be contiguous and compact, respect communities of interest, use visible geographic features, city and county boundaries, and undivided census tracts, and favor competitive districts when to do so would create no significant detriment to the other goals. Throughout the process, there were many opportunities for public input. All of the IRC meetings were public. Let's see, Penny, would you advance slides, please? We've looked at the map criteria and then the membership of the commission.
Patty, do you want me to advance the slide once more?
Yes, please. Our commissioners this past, with this current commission were Dr. Erica Newberg, who's the chair. She's an independent from Maricopa. Derek Watchman, who is the vice chair, is a Democrat from Navajo County. David Meal is a Republican from Pima County. Shireen Lerner, a Democrat from Maricopa. And Douglas York, a Republican from Maricopa. Then the next slide. There were many opportunities for public input. All of the meetings, as I said, were public. There were public comments were received during all of the meetings, and members of the public could submit additional comments or maps, their own maps, 24/7 on the website. There was a listening tour before mapping was even undertaken, which particularly focused on members of the public talking about their communities of interest. And then there's a required 30-day public comment period for the draft maps. And the commission held many hearings in quite a few locations throughout the state. The next slide. Arizona has 9 congressional districts. All of the districts have new numbers. So if you were in CD2, as I am now in CD6. So there are, everybody has a new number. So be sure you know your new congressional district number. The target population for each district is 794,611. And as I said, that has to be plus or minus only 1 from district to district. The new districts, 6 lean Republican, 3 lean Democrat, whereas the 2011 maps, 5 lean Republican and 4 lean Democrat. There are 4 competitive districts according to the Commission's measure of competitive districts. CDs 1, 4, 6, and 8 are ranked as competitive. The vote spread among the 9 districts ranged from 2.37% to 5.9%. And that's the vote range between the Republican and Democrat parties. And then CD3 and 7 are the Voting Rights Act districts. Those are minority-majority districts where the minority population can be expected to be able to elect a representative of their choice. Arizona had been expected to receive an additional 10th district after the census, but that did not happen. We did not have quite enough population gain, or other states gained even a larger percentage than Arizona. So perhaps next time. There are 30 legislative districts. So again, all of the districts' numbers have changed. The target population was 238,383. You can see 17 lean Republican, 13 Democrat. There are 5 competitive districts. You can see if you were in one of those. Again, the vote range was quite large, between 1.56% and 53.9%. And there are 7 Voting Rights Act districts, just as there were after the 2011 redistricting. So that just gives you a quick thumbnail outline of what has happened to this point. So we have new districts, we have new numbers, we have new neighbors maybe in our district. And so what happens now? And we're hoping that our panelists will be able to tell us more about that. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then each one will have an opportunity to give us information, and we'll have a Q&A session after that. So our first speaker is Jeremy Duda, who is a Phoenix native and began his career in journalism in 2003 after graduating from the University of Arizona. He's currently the associate editor of the Arizona Mirror. He closely followed the redistricting process throughout all of 2021 and frequently published stories about that process. Mr. Duda will be followed by Recorder Richer and Director Jarrett from Maricopa County. Recorder Richer is the Maricopa County Recorder, elected in November of 2020 and assuming office in January of 2021. Prior to becoming recorder, he worked as a lawyer at the law firms Septo and Johnson, LLP, and Lewis Roca, LLP. He holds a BA from Tulane University and both an MA and a JD degree from the University of Chicago. Director Jarrett is the Director of Election Day and Emergency Voting for Maricopa County. He's worked with the Maricopa County election since 2017 and was appointed to his current position in July of 2019. He has extensive operational audit experience across the county government with the expertise in managing projects, mitigating organizational risk, and identifying efficiencies or inefficiencies. Our final speaker will be Recorder Gabriella Casares Kelly from Pima County. In 2020, she was elected a recorder and became the first Native American to hold a countywide office in Pima County. She's a citizen of the Tohono O'odham Nation and from the Pisanemo District. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Arizona and a master's degree from the Northern Arizona University. So, Mr. Duda, please begin. I believe we need to. Okay, we'll spotlight him. Here we go.
I think Jeremy was
sorry about that
having
before.
some technical.
Are you okay now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, we can.
great.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
for some reason my speaker went out just at the exact right moment. So, all right, so what I'm going to start with here is kind of an overview of the districts here. And Betty, you gave kind of a good snapshot there, kind of where we're at. I'll start with the congressional districts. That's the easiest part. There's only 9 of them, as you mentioned. We did not get the 10th district. Pretty much everyone was expecting, and still kind of trying to figure out why that is. I suspect that there might not have been as much, the census might not have gone as well as it probably should have, because if you see a lot of other states, it's all about kind of the effort that got put into that. States that were expected to lose 2 seats only lost 1. States that were, could be, as they put more into it, states that were expected to gain 3 seats only got 2 because they didn't. But that had some interesting ramifications on the congressional map more than anything, because the loss of that 10th district had a lot of ripple effects throughout the rest of the map. And I think most notable be in northern Arizona. What was currently on the old map is known as CD1. On the new map will be CD2, and that's most of rural northern Arizona going down kind of across the eastern part of the state. Heavily tribal, it's where the Navajo Nation and most of the other northern tribes all are, and that's where you get to get some kind of political difficulty. That is all that for at least 20 years. That's been a very competitive district. That's very important for the tribes because they have kind of an opportunity to be the decision makers in a lot of ways there. And it might not seem like a competitive district on the old map because it's been nothing but Democrats for the past decade, but you can see that in statewide races, Republicans win that district a lot. In 2012, Mitt Romney won it. In 2016, Donald Trump won it. In 2020, Joe Biden won it. And so it's very much an up for grabs district now because of the way the population growth has focused in a lot of other parts of the state. You do not, they had to, pretty much every Democratic voter who could feasibly be in there was already there. They had to, so now this is basically a Republican district that's just barely outside the range of what the Redistricting Commission considers competitive. And that might be bad news for the Democrats in the district, potentially for the tribe, certainly for, probably for Tom O'Halloran, who's the Democrat who represents it. But elsewhere on the map, I think you mentioned there's 4 competitive congressional districts. Really, there's 3. I think you had District 8 down in Peoria. It's a competitive district that's solidly Republican. What you do have is District 1, which is a new competitive district in kind of the north and kind of Northeast Valley, North Phoenix, much of Scottsdale, that whole area. That is probably the most competitive district in the state. It's currently represented by David Schweiker. It's slightly Republican leaning. You have down in Ahwatukee, Tempe, West Mesa, you have the new 4th district that is fairly solidly Democratic leaning, but a competitive district by their metrics. And then down in Tucson, kind of the successor to the new 6th district, which is the successor to the old 2nd district, represented by Ann Kirkpatrick, Ron Barber, Martha McSally. That is also Republican leaning and but competitive, and that was kind of a major battleground at the very end of the commission's work, as you saw one of the Democratic commissioners really put her foot down in the last day of debate over the congressional maps, and throughout a day of very hard-fought arguments, managed to make that slightly less Republican leaning, slightly more competitive. the congressional districts is what get, I think most of the attention from a lot of folks, but probably the more important part here for us here in the state of Arizona is the legislative map. And that's where the real action is. You have 13 solidly Republican districts, 12 solidly Democratic districts, and 5 competitive districts, 4 of them Republican leaning, 1 of them Democratic leaning. One of those Republican leaning competitive districts might not actually be competitive, because what you have to keep in mind is how they define competitiveness. Now, 10 years ago, the last commission had, I think, something like 8 different mathematical formulas based on various things it used to determine how competitive district was. So they could take every district and run them through all 8 of them. You can see, okay, but in this one it's 2% Republican, or this one is 3% Democrat, or whatever. This time around they only have 1, so that does not give us nearly as much of a kind of a snapshot of how these things are going to look. They took 9 statewide races from 2016, 2018, and 2020, and kind of aggregated the results, and then used that to determine how far it leaned towards the Republicans or the Democrats. And basically anything within 7%, one way or the other, was considered competitive. And they also would show how many of those 9 races were won by the Republicans and the Democrats respectively. And so you see a district that may look, it's 5% Republican, so it's within the competitive range, but Republicans won all 9 of those races, including the presidential in 2020, where you saw Biden win in a lot of areas where Republicans traditionally are victorious. Whether that will be competitive kind of remains to be seen, and this is kind of the time will tell factor, because 10 years ago, if you look at the legislature right now, it's 31-29 in the House, 16-14 in the Senate. Republicans have a 1-vote majority, which is really the slimmest majorities it's been for the most part since the 1960s, since the Republicans took control of the legislature in the first place. And if you looked at what those maps, the competitiveness metrics for those maps a decade ago, it's really, you would not necessarily have been able to tell that some of these districts would go the way they did. There are districts that started off looking very competitive that ended up not being very competitive at all. And then there are some districts that, if you would have told me in Chandler, for example, the old District 17, if you would have told me 10 years ago that that would elect a Democrat to the House, I probably would have laughed. No way, I would have said. And that has turned out to be very competitive. The successor district in that area, by the way, is probably the most competitive in the state now, the new District 13. So you have to look at where the growth is going to be, what kind of growth there's going to be, like out in that Chandler district, for example. I think one of the biggest things that happened there is that you had Intel and other high-tech industries doing some massive expansions, bringing in a lot of voters who tend to lean more towards the Democratic side, and that really helped kind of tilt the partisan balance in that district. So you kind of have to look at where that growth is going to be. Other districts where high growth areas where you have a lot, more out in the West Valley, the East Valley, folks who tend to kind of lean more towards the GOP. So you have to look at kind of where that growth is going to be. I think up in the North Valley, the new District 2, it's an area where you're probably going to see, it's very competitive, but probably an area where you're going to see some more Republican leaning growth over the course of the decade. So we'll have to see how competitive that turns out. One note on competitiveness, I know that's very important to the league. That's obviously been an issue that you have all been pushing a lot this year, 10 years ago when I covered the commission before. What goes into kind of balancing all these criteria? Betty, you mentioned the 6 criteria, and one of the 6th one of which is competitiveness. Now, advocates for competitiveness will say, these aren't numbered in order. That's not the order of importance. But there is one very important caveat on that, is it's the only criterion that says you must consider this, but only if it's not to the significant detriment of the other criteria. And this is kind of an out for folks who don't necessarily want as much competitiveness, because you have to balance the Voting Rights Act, you have to balance equal population roughly on the legislative districts. Much more precisely on the congressional side, the legislative districts have a little bit more latitude one way or the other. Political divisions, natural boundaries, and then you get the big one. The big one of the 2 big fighting points along with competitiveness is communities of interest. And this is where you see some of the biggest battles at the commission. Is what is a community of interest? It is kind of a vague catch-all term that basically describes any grouping of people who have common interests, common needs, common desires. That can be, a particular neighborhood or region, Ahwatukee, Maryvale, which are kind of distinct areas within the Phoenix area. It can be a group of people who largely rely on the same industry, have economic interests. It can be people who rely on a particular transportation corridor. It can be a university community around ASU or U of A. It can be so many different things. And so you have that criterion is you have to respect communities of interest, which even what it means to respect a community of interest is not really well defined. Does it mean you have to put them with people who vote like them, who think like them? Does it mean you have to put them in a competitive district so that their voice can be heard more? Does it mean you just kind of have to do what they want? Yuma, I think, is a good example of this. 10 years, traditionally they'd always been, the whole Yuma County had always been packaged together in a single legislative district. 10 years ago, they actually split it in half. They took the southern half and put it in a Democratic district with southwestern Tucson, the Tohono O'odham Nation. The northern part got in a district that stretched all the way out into like the West Valley, like Goodyear, Litchfield Park. And folks in Yuma were not happy about this a decade ago. It was the Voting Rights Act that kind of necessitated that. They wanted another VRA district in southern Arizona, so they took that southern part of Yuma, which is heavily Latino, heavily Democratic. 10 years later, everyone in Yuma on both sides of the political aisle went back to the commission and said, hey, we really like that. That gives us twice as much representation in the legislature. So our community of interest wants to be split in half again. And that led to a lot of ripple effects around the rest of the map. So even what it means to respect a community of interest, let alone kind of what a community of interest is, I think is, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder every time. But that was, I think probably where some of the biggest fights were. One more, I think, side note on competitiveness before kind of open it up to some questions is the Voting Rights Act, which is also, I think, a lot of folks underappreciate how much this can conflict with the competitiveness criterion. Is that the Voting Rights Act requires that you have to give minority communities districts where they can elect the candidate of their choice. Well, usually it will mean someone of their same racial or ethnic group, not necessarily. It just has to mean that the candidate that those voters prefer, they have the power to get that person elected. And so in the congressional map, for example, you have CD3 and in the Phoenix area, CD7 down in southern Arizona. But what this also does is that you have to make this so bulletproof to ensure that in those two districts, for example, they can elect a Latino member of Congress. So you have to pack a lot of Democrats into there to ensure that it's never going to go the other way. And that really takes, and in a state like Arizona where Democrats are kind of in the minority, you have to take a lot of folks. You basically have to take Democrats that could be put into other districts and made more competitive. I think Chairwoman Newberg pointed out near the end of the commission's work that once you factor in those two Voting Rights Act districts, the two predominantly Democratic districts, if you made all 7 of the other districts equal, each one would average like 6.5% Republican. So, and I've heard this even from the chairwoman of the last commission 10 years ago, who was very gung-ho about trying to make as many competitive districts as possible, is that once you take those VRA districts, that really only leave so many Democrats to go around elsewhere. I'm sorry, I'm reading a note that went up. Okay, yes, so something more wanted me to address communities of interest in Tucson. And this was another one of the biggest flashpoints on the legislative map is the new legislative District 17, which we're going to be hearing about for the next decade. So this is a district that covers kind of the northern and eastern Tucson, like suburbs and exurbs, predominantly conservative areas that maybe are not necessarily so happy about being packaged in with predominantly Democratic city of Tucson. You saw some shenanigans there where a Pima County Democratic or Republican Party official actually submitted a proposed map. A lot of people submitted proposed maps to the commission. One of the Republican commissioners who was from Tucson got an email from a business group, said, "Hey, we really like this map. Take a look at it." And that very quickly got kind of fast tracked and adopted into the map. And that made changing that from what was likely to be a very competitive district into what's likely to be, a very Republican one. And so that is, I think we're going to be hearing a lot of folks who are unhappy about that pretty much for the next decade or so. But what I wanted to do now is I think probably a lot of folks have some questions or comments, and I'd love to address as many of those as I could. And so I'd love to open this up to some questions, or if there's any issues other folks would like me to kind of expound upon.
Yes, we do have some questions for you. One person wants to know what makes the district competitive and what is vote spread?
What makes it competitive is, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of mathematical ways you can determine this. A decade ago, they had about 8 different metrics. This time they had 1. They took the cumulative aggregate results of 9 statewide races from 2016, 2018, and 2020. They excluded the ones that were the blowouts, the McCain's reelection in 2016, Doug Ducey's reelection in 2018, because those kind of skewed the results too much. So they took 9 and aggregated the results and kind of showed what the percentage spread was towards the Republicans or the Democrats on the cumulative level, plus the breakdown of how many of those 9 races were won by Republicans versus Democrats. Now, anything within 4%, anything within 7%, they considered generally competitive. Anything within 4%, they considered highly competitive. So the closer you get to 0, obviously the more competitive a district is likely to be. But sometimes there can be some red flags. If a district says 4%, 4.5% towards one party, but one party won all 9 of those races, you might look at that and say the percentage number there is a bit deceiving. It might not be as competitive as it looks based on that. But again, populations are shifting, populations are growing. Arizona demographically has been changing a lot. So in the end, it's not always easy to predict how competitive a lot of these districts are really going to be over the long run.
It's something I'm sure that you'll be writing about throughout the next few years.
It's going to keep me very busy, I'm sure.
Yes. Someone asked if there's a simple a way of identifying the old district number versus the new district number.
There's only a simple way. I mean, there's the old maps are still available online. I'm not sure if you plug this into the like your voter registration stuff, and I think we have some county election folks who can probably speak to that a little better than I could. For if that's something that through voter registration databases or whatever is easy to look into. The maps are online, so it's pretty easy if you know where to find those to look at the old map and say, here's my district, or look at the new one and say, okay, there's where my house is. So that's my new district is LD 5, for example. That's where I live.
Mm-hmm. We actually will be providing everyone with 2 links that they can follow, put in their address, and find their new district. So
excellent. That
information will flash up for everyone at the end, and also send it out in a follow-up email. So you would be able to find your new district number. Another question is, are independent voters considered by the IRC in redistricting?
Well, they are, and this is one of the things that, this is the reason why you can't really use voter registration numbers to determine competitiveness, because about 1/3 of the registered voters in this state are independents. They actually outnumber Democrats, and they're very close to outnumbering Republicans statewide. In Maricopa County, I know Recorder Richer recently noted that independents were now the largest block of registered voters. So when you say considered, they are, but it's kind of tricky in terms of how do you consider them when it comes to competitiveness. That's why they use the results of these races as opposed to the raw voter registration numbers, because an independent can mean a lot of things. It can mean you lean slightly to the right or slightly to the left, but you're very centrist. It could mean you're very far to the right or very far to the left. If someone's independent, as people told me in the past, if they all believed the same thing, they'd have a political party. But I think independents can cover pretty much every possible spot on the political spectrum. So you have to look at how people actually vote. And so you could create a predominantly independent district, but just looking at those registration numbers, you would have absolutely no idea which way politically how that district is likely to lean. So you have to use those vote results to really get some more insight into that.
Thank you.
Betty, if I might weigh in on
Yes,
one
please.
quick question. And maybe this is a Betty and Jeremy question, which is, do you know if the Census Bureau has released demographic data so that we can see the undercount of the Latino population? I believe they did do that, but can you verify that, Betty or Jeremy?
There was an announcement from the Census Bureau last week that they were going to be releasing the data, but I don't know if that actually has happened.
Okay, yeah, I had not heard that, but I know that's certainly been a major concern, and it's here in Arizona, I think, especially among the Latino community and the Native American community, and that the possibility of an undercount. And some folks advocated for kind of drawing districts in a way that might take that into account. But the problem with that is you have to draw based on the numbers you have. The census is, for all intents and purposes, the official count of the state's population. So especially in a congressional district where the populations have to be pretty much exactly the same, you can't say, well, we think there's probably more people here than the census counted, so we're going to draw to reflect that. You have to use the numbers that you have.
Jeremy, I have two questions. One is in the chat, but if you could answer that, and that is, before you answer the question about takeaways, can you answer this question about, do you believe that the meetings of the IRC were actually public? There seemed to be a lot of meetings that were held with stakeholders and so on. Can you speak to that in your perception as a reporter on this topic?
I mean, they certainly seemed much less public than they were a decade ago because of the pandemic. The public was not really there in person. I was generally, me and maybe one or two other reporters were usually the only ones who weren't associated with the commission who were there in person. And I think that changes a lot, because 10 years ago, every time they wanted to move a line one way or the other, 24 people would stand up and say, well, I think this hurts my community, or I think this does this or that. I like this or don't like this for this or that reason. This time you didn't have that. Everyone submitted public comment online or whatever. And I think the commissioners, well, I guess I couldn't say how much they did or didn't read that, but it's definitely not the same. It definitely didn't feel the same. Now, I think you mentioned discussions with stakeholders, and this is another kind of controversial issue, is these folks are all getting input from the outside. And I'm in the process of trying to find out exactly who it was who was providing most of that input. But there are times when that had some major effects on how the lines were drawn. I think we had an issue where Laura Pastores, a Phoenix City Councilwoman, was talking with the chairwoman and saying, well, I really want this district to be like this instead of this. And lo and behold, it turns out that that those changes would correspond roughly with their city council district and make that overlap with the congressional district. You had a couple of the Republican commissioners who made a couple of small but very significant changes on the legislative map based on input from the outside. They came back from a lunch break at one point and said, oh, we just got bombarded with calls from this community called Liberty right next to Buckeye, where they really don't want to be with this district. They want to be with this district. So let's change that. Everyone said, okay. And immediately I get a text message saying, hey, this Republican state senator lives in this district, and this change moves her from a Democratic district to a Republican district. So who's making that request? More to the point, for some of the news of the past week, on the very last day, they made some final changes to 2 congressional districts in northern Arizona, one of which was the predominantly Native American district. And at the very end, they had everything settled, and the Republican commissioners had gotten a call during the break and said, oh, I want to move this little area of Flagstaff from this district to that district. Well, that's where Senator Wendy Rogers lives. That moved her from a Democratic district to a Republican district and allowed her to run again. So there is a lot of input coming in from the outside, and we really don't know where most of that's coming from. And that's something, as I said, I'm in the process of trying to find out, because for purposes of transparency, I think that's very important.
Jeremy, Betty, before we move on to our rest of the panelists, from a timing perspective, I have 2 questions that would summarize some of these broader questions. One is, is there, we're stuck with this for 10 years. The people's lives are impacted by this for 10 years. So what's the value of analyzing this whole issue of lack of competitiveness to what happened in 2011? And how can that be utilized to ensure that the next, in 2031, we reset back to paying attention to what was called out, which is competitiveness. That's one. And part two of that is, what did you take away, which are sort of lessons learned, and how do we move forward to bring proportional and balanced maps, fair maps, if you will.
I guess the first part I'll address there in terms of kind of how you can use this information for the next time, which I guess is so much comes down to who gets appointed to the commission. So recruit folks who represent your views, represent what you'd like to see happen there. That 5 people and really one who determines kind of everything with that independent. And when they do have these public hearings around the state for people to provide their input, make sure go make your voice heard, and make sure to make your arguments in ways that are going to kind of resonate with the criteria. Explain why your community of interest needs this or that, why it needs to be in a competitive district. I think some people are going to be more responsive to that than others. And I'm sorry, what was the second question there?
Your takeaway about this whole process. And
my takeaway, I think, this will probably be a slightly unpopular view with both sides, but I think the independent chair who really holds all the power was, for the most part, independent, was pretty fair. I think it was very important to her to be fair. And I know Democrats for a lot of the process were very upset with her, especially because she had a lot of former Republican ties. She was a former Republican herself. But I did hear from a lot of Republicans throughout the process saying, people telling me things like, oh, we thought we were going to have a Republican version of the chair from 10 years ago, who very strongly leaned towards the Democrats. And he says, we thought we were going to get a Republican version of her, and instead we get an actual independent, just our luck. So I think my takeaway was this was more or less the way the process is kind of supposed to work. Now, whether it should work like that is another story. I think having all the power in that one person really shows that we probably shouldn't do that. Is that my thoughts have always been that it should be 9 people, 3 and 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, 3 independents. And that puts the control, all the power on those 3 independents, but it doesn't make it so contingent on really that one person.
well, it would be reflective of the actual registrations, right? I mean, you've got a third,
that would be reflective of the registrations,
might,
absolutely.
Yeah. Betty, if you are ready to transition, Jeremy, I hope you will stay on, because my suspicion is we're going to get a lot more questions addressed to everybody on the panel, if you can.
I hear my kids in the background, so I may have to duck out soon, but I'll try to stay on as long as I can.
I'm mostly just planning on asking you questions for my segment.
Okay. Recorder Richard.
Well, we certainly thank you very much for your time today and for your insight on the process. It's always good to get multiple viewpoints and to as to what happened and what the takeaways are. So thank you so much for your time today, Mr. Duda. And we do hope you're able to stay on. Now we're going to return to our recorders. And I believe that Recorder Richard and Director Jarrett are going to go first. They have slides here that we are now seeing on the screen. So I'm going to turn it over to Recorder Richard. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. I'll just say a few things to kick us off here, and then Scott's put together a really nice PowerPoint presentation, and then I know Recorder Casares Kelly has heavily engaged on this topic. I actually probably have the least to say about the nuts and bolts of this, so I'm going to defer to the other 2 panelists largely, but there are a few sort of broader things I wanted to talk about, and you all have heard me talk before plenty of times, so I don't think I need to talk that much. But one thing is that the notion of us not getting a 10th congressional district, because Jeremy was absolutely right when he said all the conversation was about, would we get a 10th, would we get even an 11th congressional district? People were talking about at some point. And it was almost a fait accompli that we would get a 10th congressional district. And the reason this matters isn't, some of you might be thinking, well, this is great. I'll have one fewer bloviating, self-aggrandizing politician to deal with. And, maybe that will mean I'll have a nice Kia commercial instead of a politician's commercial for at least 30 seconds of my day. But this actually has a very significant monetary impact on Arizona. I think Jeremy pulled some numbers, or maybe it was Krista Rose, but because so much of the federal dollar allocations to states is determined by the number of congressional districts that your state has. This translated to hundreds of millions of dollars. Maybe Jeremy has an exact number on that, for Arizona over the course of 10 years. And so, regardless of how you think that influenced the maps or the politics of it or the partisan balance of it, that was a very significant thing for Arizona to not get. And I think it's a shame just in terms of federal funding. Jeremy's right regarding the independents. Independents recently did overtake Republicans as the largest party in Maricopa County. So that was a significant development that happened in Maricopa County just this past week. And I think it really brings to bear the point about that Jeremy made, that the IRC should maybe be 3-3-3 instead of its 3-3-1 makeup. One that would be reflective of the voter registration totals, as Penny suggested, but also I just think that you're increasingly it takes a special type of person to be this one person, because all the attention, all the scrutiny, all the burden is placed on this one person who really has to commit a year of her life to this process, if not more. It's an unpaid position. And, I think Erica Newberg is a very moral person who did a very respectable job, and I think she went about it in a professional, methodical manner. And there was relatively little hubbub, especially compared with 10 years ago. But just given all that she had to go through, and given all that Colleen Mathis had to go through 10 years ago, I worried that we're having this moral hazard issue where truly only a sociopath would sign up for this in the future, because, who else would want to subject themselves to that type of thing? Of course, some people ask me that about being in the recorder's office as well. So, perhaps there's some comparisons there, but I do think that, by giving that person 2 other independents, that it could make that person's life a little bit better, and maybe can encourage a healthier process. The other thing, and I might get booed out of the League of Women Voters panel for this, but I'm not so sure that input is necessarily a salubrious thing for the process. I think this turns into very much of a squeaky wheel gets the grease type of thing. And Jeremy alluded to a few of those instances in which they were going down a methodical process, and then all of a sudden they took a sort of sudden deviation from their course based off of a torrent of emails that they received from a particular interest group. I'm not so sure that this shouldn't be treated like a jury, where they should just go at it from as sort of, fact-driven process as possible, where they cloistered themselves away from the outside world. They cloistered themselves away from any individual politicians, and they just take the data and the maps from the professionals, and they go about doing that. Just because, I don't like the notion that it is simply those who can show up at a random time when the IRC is meeting and can scream about how unfair or how wonderful this process is, or that it's those who have connections to certain political players who wield influence with the IRC members that really can shape this process, when this is a process that is supposed to be reflective for all 7 million plus Arizonans. And so that's something I think about. Regarding my congressional district, this was never, I probably gave the least amount of thought to it. I live 4 doors down from Ruben Gallego, so I assumed that, he'll be my congressman no matter what. And so I didn't follow the ebbs and flows of that too much. I do want to get Jeremy's crystal ball in terms of where he thinks will be congressional district breakdown in 2023 and where you think will be in 2029, because I think there's a notion that what might be advantageous to Republicans right now might not be advantageous to Republicans at the end of the congressional district, or at the end of the 10-year period. It's not really for me to pontificate on that, but that's something that I am interested in. So I think those were sort of my broad, and I really have to commend Jeremy's writing on this. He followed this very closely. This was a lot. There's a lot of meetings. There's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of, all of a sudden that map got blown up. And also for those of you who are interested in sort of piecing together, well, which legislative members go where now, he wrote a good article that I actually have on my favorites list, and it's who won and who lost with the new legislative districts. And it lists out where all the incumbent candidates are now placed. And so I'm going to post that in the chat box. So with that obnoxiously long introduction, Scott, do you want to turn into our slides?
Sure. Thank you, Recorder Richard. And for elections departments and recorders offices statewide, really the redistricting process is really an incredibly technical and administrative process. We aren't interested in whether districts are competitive. We're not interested in breakdowns of parties or any of those types of things. We're wondering how these new maps, these new boundaries, these new lines are going to impact how we can do our jobs, right? In Maricopa County, for a August primary, we have anywhere, well, in 2020, we had 15,000 different ballot styles. For the November 2020 general election, we had over 10,000 different ballot styles. Because of the changes, we're adding a couple hundred different precincts into the process, and I'll actually go through that in some of the slides. We actually went from 20 to 22 legislative districts. So that just means there's more ballot styles, and ensuring that we can design those ballot styles, making sure that we can get the correct ballot style to the voter, all of those very technical things. And pretty much every time I'm getting ready to do a presentation on redistricting and re-precincting, the recorder gives me a pep talk and says, this is incredibly important stuff, but try not to put them to sleep, because it is so technical and can be a little bit boring. So please bear with me as I go through some of the slides. It may not be quite as interesting as Mr. Duda's presentation, but I find it fascinating. So thank you.
But I want people to appreciate just how much work goes behind every single one of these things, because Scott and a gentleman in our office named Gary really spent hours and hours and hours. And, you know, both Recorder Casares Kelly and I had the fortune or misfortune of taking office just at the point in which there were many questions about the elections ecosystem anyways. But on top of that, you know, this redistricting process now, for some of these, the county recorder's office and the county elections departments and the board of supervisors have sort of primary responsibility. For others, the IRC has primary responsibility, but we still have to do a lot of work on the back end, and we have to react to all of the information that they ultimately decide on, which, as Scott can attest, put us in a little bit of a time crunch, because it didn't come until later than perhaps everyone had wished, given what COVID did to disrupt the process.
And that's exactly right, Recorder Richard. And why this portion of the presentation will be Maricopa County centric. The situations that I'm going to be describing were affecting all the counties within Arizona very similarly. So I think all of you can have something to take away, even if you're not a resident of Maricopa County. But just a few things to highlight about Maricopa County. So the elections department does report up to both the elected Maricopa County Board of Supervisors as well as the elected recorder. As far as redistricting, the Board of Supervisors plays a role in approving different boundaries that are within their responsibility. That's actually the Board of Supervisors lines, voting precincts, justice court precincts, and then the recorder's responsibility is in their office is to assist the elections department in all ways that are technical, doing this type of analysis. Recorder Richard mentioned a gentleman by the name of Gabriella. He's our GIS director, and we could not get through a redistricting plan without him and his team, and the hundreds of hours that they had spent working through Christmas, working through holidays, New Year's Eve, all of those types of things to try to review the independent redistricting lines, provide technical feedback, and then now incorporating all of that into our and implementing those new boundaries into our mapping systems so that we can be ready for 2022. And there was a comment, and as I go through this presentation, I'll show how voters and members of the public can view this information. Mr. Duda had mentioned that you could go to your different elections departments or recorder's office's website to try to find out where your current congressional district, legislative district, all of those types of things, where your house is within those. So I'll provide that demonstration. but we are also conducting elections. So we're in the middle of our March 8th jurisdictional election. And so that meant that we are on hold. We can't implement any of the congressional or legislative district boundaries into our systems because we are in that March 8th election. And a lot of people think, oh, March 8th, well, why didn't you get this done in January 24 when the IRC certified those elections? Well, elections start, we're mailing out ballots to Qa voters 45 days before an election. We're building those ballots even several weeks before that. So when we were readying for the March 8th election, it really started in December, and we could not make changes within our systems past that December timeframe. But here's a few stats on Maricopa County. We were the fastest growing county in the nation from 2010 to 2020. We added over 603,000 residents to our county. We do make up about 62% of the total residents of the entire state of Arizona. So as far as the number of congressional districts, we have 8 of the 9 overlapping Maricopa County's boundaries. We have 22 of the 30 legislative districts overlapping our boundaries. That was 20 prior to this redistricting effort. We do have 5 Board of Supervisor districts. That's not always the case. Some counties will have 3 Board of Supervisor districts, but Maricopa County does have 5. Our community college districts and our special healthcare districts follow the same lines as our Board of Supervisor districts. And again, that's not always the case. There are a few community college districts in some other counties that don't follow those, and they may even overlap multiple counties. We have 26 Justice of the Court precincts. And then there's 6 cities and towns that go through a redistricting effort as well. City of Buckeye, City of Peoria, Surprise, Mesa, Phoenix, I'm missing one in there. The only one of those 6 cities and towns that did not go through a redistricting effort this time around was City of Phoenix, and they've chosen to hold off this year and do it next year. We also have 3 schools and technical districts that go through redistricting. And then we had 832 voting precincts that went into effect as of January 2nd. That's increasing now because of the IRC changes, but I'll go through those as well. So there is some confusion about what is redistricting versus re-precincting. And essentially it's just the type of district that we're talking about. So if it is a Board of Supervisors district, a legislative district, a congressional district, then you're going through redistricting. If it's a precinct, Justice Court precinct, or a voting precinct, you're going through re-precincting. So in Maricopa County's role, we're essentially the glue between all those different entities that are performing redistricting. So if it's at the statewide level or for the LDs, the congressional districts, or if it's at the local level, cities and towns, school districts, or if it's at the Board of Supervisors level, performing those Board of Supervisor boundaries or adjusting, we're the one taking all of that information and data, incorporating it into our mapping systems, and then transmitting all of that information up to the Secretary of State's office so that they can have the correct information in their statewide voter registration system, and also for their candidate filing systems. And you may have heard the Secretary of State's their eQual system. And that's been in the news a little bit lately because they're waiting for county data to be able to upload into that system. And then they need that data then to make the eQual system live with the brand new boundaries. And they need all the different counties to go live at the exact same time. So if one county went early, that meant that the Secretary of State would have to shut down that eQual system for a period of time while the last county, the straggler counties, uploaded their information. So they've actually done a really great job working with all the counties to try to minimize that timeline of how long that eQual system will be down. And I think we're all targeting sometime in mid-March of when those lines will be uploaded into the eQual system. So here's just another slide that showed the different duties or who's responsible for the different lines or that need to be redrawn during re-precincting. It's been covered by several of our panelists, Betty and Jeremy previously, but here we also show where the statutory or the constitutional reference of what gives those entities the authority to do redistricting. So the IRC tackles congressional legislative districts. That comes from Again, is covered in Prop 106 in 2000 that was approved, and then put that right into the Arizona Constitution. The Board of Supervisors, it follows statutory authority, and that's 11212. And then we have the community colleges, the special healthcare districts, that's the community colleges 151411, and then the special healthcare districts is 445 5501. And then those other statutes or those other districts that will be going into that also go through redistricting. I do want to point out that the Board of Supervisors districts, usually those are done in December, but because of, and they have to be approved by the board by December 1st of the odd year or the year prior to a general election. But because of the delay in census data, the legislature passed in 2021 SB 1107. And then that gave a grace period for the Board of Supervisors to approve those lines. Now they have a timeline, and you'll actually see that on my next slide, but of July 1, 2022. But then those lines will not go into effect until January of 2024, the year preceding the next general election, because it will be after the candidate filing deadline.
Has Pima already put their Board of Supervisors line into effect? No. Okay.
So this is a great timeline that sort of shows the process and when the different boundaries get changed. The gray items are the Census Bureau items. The gold items are what the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors is responsible. The blue boxes are what the IRC changes, and the red are when the city and towns redrew their boundaries. So the first dot here you see in February 2021, that's the normal timeline of when the Census Bureau usually releases their population data for the entire redistricting effort to start across the board. But that unfortunately did not get released in February because of the challenges of the pandemic. So it was really pushed back until August. And that really put a time crunch on everything that all of these entities had to do within a very short time. Really what resulted in the Independent Redistricting Commission not certifying the maps prior to the end of the year, those rolling over into 2022. So if you look, August was when the census data released their data. The IRC began their work also right around shortly after that data was released. That's when the county was going through re-precincting efforts for, and here our Maricopa County, for our voting precincts and our justice court precincts. We had the last time we had updated our voting precincts was in 2018, and those changes were minimal. We attempt to keep our voting precincts under 5,000 total voters. We really find that that's the sweet spot in Maricopa County for us to have smooth, efficient elections. And many of our precincts, because of the incredible amount of growth, had increased to well over 10,000 voters. So we took that opportunity in September. We went out and had various public comment meetings, meeting with the different Board of Supervisor districts, all the different changes. We had over 130 changes that we implemented, primarily to draw those precincts to be smaller, get them down below 10,000, closer to 5,000. There were some situations where we had some voting precincts where the boundaries were cutting through homes, apartment complexes. We took the opportunity to address those and then to align those precincts and any of the changes that we are making because of the justice court precinct changes, align those with our voting precincts, because statute does require a voting precinct cannot cross over the boundaries of another jurisdictional boundary. So a congressional district, a legislative district, a Board of Supervisor district, a justice court precinct district, an individual precinct needs to be wholly within all of those and can't have a boundary cut through the middle. And we'll talk more about that in some of my upcoming slides. So, but then we get to December 2021. That's when our cities and towns were able to submit their redrawn boundaries and redistricting. That's also when the IRC, the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission, approved their congressional lines, but those did not go into effect on December 22nd. They actually provided just over a week for the counties to review all of that information and provide technical input. to find if there were any administrative challenges created by those new boundaries, those new congressional district and legislative district boundaries.
And Scott, what's an example of that?
Yeah, so good question, Recorder Richard. So what we found, and I'll actually have a slide that demonstrates one of the pieces of technical feedback that we provided back, and unfortunately the IRC didn't accept, but it was if a boundary was creating an area of land that there was no voters present. We try to avoid those situations, or because of the way they drew the congressional district boundary or the legislative district boundary, it created a very small voting precinct. In some instances, and I will provide a demonstration of this, there was only 3 voters created because of it. So notifying the IRC of these types of situations, so hopefully they can address those boundaries. Now, as Mr. Duda had described with the congressional districts, they can only be off 1 voter at most. So if we're providing 40 different instances that we're finding issues with these lines, and they're making those types of adjustments, and all the other counties are providing that same technical feedback, I get how it could be very challenging to make those accommodations when they can only be off up to 1 voter at most. So they accepted some of our feedback, but most of it they did not. And then that's what we're resolving right now in that big gold box, March 2022. That's what we're working through to update all of our voting precincts to get them approved for Maricopa County. We have a very small window to get all of this information updated and into our voter registration system, get it into the statewide database, because we have this March 8th election. It will take us, and that's for the city of Tempe. They're having a city council election, 3 open spots, 7 different candidates. And it will take us a few days after that March 8th election to prepare the canvas information. And then we also have a May jurisdictional election for the city of Litchfield Park, and very likely a runoff for the city of Tempe. And we have to get ballots mailed for that UOCAVA deadline and printed starting in late March, March 23rd. So we have this very narrow window of opportunity to implement all of those changes that were coming from these new congressional and legislative district lines. And there was a comment that was asking, when they go to our website, why can't they see them in some of our maps, our online maps? It's for this very reason. We haven't been able to update and implement those because we've been in the middle of this March 8th jurisdictional election. And then the last effort that will be within Maricopa County for redistricting is this July 1, 2022 date. So in April, May, and June, the Board of Supervisors will be going through and redrawing their Board of Supervisor boundaries. And then those would then go into effect, as I stated previously, in January 2024. So the next, so in Maricopa County, we're proposing to the Board of Supervisors 387 precinct changes. They fall into 6 different county categories. And I do want to point out that our approach was just to adhere to aligning boundaries with the new congressional district and legislative districts. So we weren't making any other changes. So it's still requiring 387 changes. So we're going from 832 total precincts to 935. We categorize these as non-complex changes. I'll have an example of this. Reconfiguration changes when we're having to redraw the boundary entirely. Maybe name a precinct something entirely different. Some of these I mentioned, Recorder Richard asked, what was an example of some of the technical feedback we were providing? And some of those were these very small precincts. Unfortunately, we will have 15 of those going forward. The vast majority of the changes are alignment type changes, and I have an example of that as well. And then we have some single address communities. This is an apartment complex or a mobile home park where a legislative or congressional district boundary is cutting right through the middle of those. And I'll show you an example of that and how we're addressing those. And then there were a few that we had to coordinate some of the changes with some of our Native American communities, in specific the Salt River Pima Indian community, and the Gila River Indian community. We had a couple of precinct changes that we need to work through those changes with them. So this resulted in 104 new precincts and 23 no voter precincts. So we call those NVPs. And here is an example of what we were saying, a non-complex precinct. And here you have an image of two different, or the same precinct. On the left, you have the current precinct as it exists today. And then what we're proposing to the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors next week at a public board meeting on, we're presenting actually a very similar presentation to this on March 7th. And then all these changes will go before the board and they'll consider them on March 9th. But in the center, we have this Acacia precinct. It's in gray. It's being split by the legislative district line 2 and legislative district 27, right down one of our main roads here in the Phoenix area, Thunderbird. So this is requiring us to take that current precinct Acacia, move that north of the legislative district boundary, and then create a brand new precinct, Surrey, which is south. Lots of people wonder where we get these types of names for our precincts. And usually it's based on geographical areas, landmarks, and predominantly street names. So Acacia is a street name in that orange area above the legislative district line, and Surrey is a street name south of that area. So we're not incredibly creative as we're going through renaming these precincts. I know the recorder submitted a few names to us, but we didn't accept many of them. You have an example of one of the names, Recorder Richard?
I just thought it was a great opportunity to share some of our most famous and most proud Arizonans like Emma Stone and Sir Charles Barkley.
So I don't believe we're going to be having any precincts named after those individuals.
And Jeremy Duda, of course, we tried to do that, but Scott struck down that one as well.
I'm willing to sacrifice the Duda precinct if we can get a Charles Barkley precinct, actually.
Here's another, so I mentioned an alignment type precinct. So this is a situation where the IRC drew a legislative district boundary going down the southbound lanes of the Loop 303. So in Maricopa County, the Loop 303 is in our far west valley, where our precinct was going and drawn up the northbound lane. So we had to adjust a precinct boundary, moving it to the west by about 30 yards. And that's why you see the Posada precinct, the Cortesa, the Orchid, the Waddell, all of these precincts have to change, but it's a very slight minimal change, just moving a boundary over a few yards. I mentioned a single address community where we have a boundary going through an apartment complex, mobile home park. There's a lot actually going on with the changes here. This is the result of Legislative District 4, Legislative District 3, and Legislative District 2, those precinct boundaries splitting multiple of our precincts. But I really want to focus on this little black box up here, this focus area. And if we zoom in, this is what we see. And this is actually a mobile home park. But I want to actually go to the next slide. You can get an even better visual. So this is one of the instances we did provide some technical feedback to the IRC, letting them know that this legislative district boundary between LD3 and LD4 was cutting through homes, something that we find is an instance where it's very confusing to voters for them to know what side of the boundary do they actually live on. And you can even see this is almost a 50-50 split. We can get even much closer in our mapping system and determine that the majority of this house really falls below the line. And that's based on what the guidance that we're going to have to do when we're splitting up which of these homes. We usually go to the Census Bureau and see if there's census data that shows us where this house actually falls. We work with the IRC, and if they have enough data to show us where they actually placed the voters. So we incorporate all of that type of information, and then we do an analysis to determine where are those voters actually living, which legislative district, congressional district, board of supervisor district, do they fall in? And then they'll be getting this information on their voter ID cards. So, and that's what brings us to what voters need to know. So we will be having updating all of our precincts in the next few weeks here in Maricopa County. However, some of that was very technical type of information that I reviewed, but it should be very seamless to the voters. They will get a voter registration ID card because the Independent Redistricting Commission, when they redraw their boundaries, they renumber all those boundaries. Same with all of our precincts. We alphabetize them in order of number. So every voter will be getting a voter registration ID card. That ID card will tell them what is their congressional district, what is their legislative district, what is their board of supervisor district, what is their justice court precinct, in addition to other information about their registration status, what party they're registered with, all of those types of things. So voters should be on the lookout to receive those cards. Maricopa County will be again mailing those out in late March after we've been able to update that into our voter registration system. For many voters, I think nearly every county, and I don't want to steal Gabriella's thunder, but every county has really moved from a precinct-based voting model to a vote center-based voting model. So, and that means that voters will no longer have to then make sure that they're in that right, correct precinct. That would have been a challenge in years past. Now, because in Maricopa County, we adopted the vote center model in 2020, they don't have to go to that specific location. They can go anywhere. So that's one barrier that's no longer an issue for voters. And then we also, I just wanted to highlight some of the key dates that voters should be anticipating coming up. So March 7th, candidate filing, actually it's today, March 5th, candidate filing starts. March 7th is when our office is open so that they could drop off that filing paperwork. And then that ends April 4th. It is a gubernatorial election year. So that means that statewide candidates, governor, attorney general, secretary of state will be on the ballot. You have a US Senate contest that will be on the ballot. Again, every 2 years, our congressional representatives are on the ballot, and then all of our state legislature as well. Here are some key dates. Oh, I didn't put this. It's not hashtag. It's 90 days. I believe it's May 3rd or 4th. I'll have to look that up and put that in the chat. July 5th is the deadline to register for the voter registration or for the August primary. We'll be mailing out ballots July 6th. So usually it's 29 days before the election is the voter registration deadline, but because that falls on July 4th, it actually moves 1 day. So it's 28 days before the election. That's why there's only 1 day between the voter registration deadline and the date we mail out ballots. And that also occurs in October because of the Columbus holiday. So voter registration deadline falls on October 10th. It now gets pushed to October 11th. That means we're mailing out ballots October 12th. And election day is November 8th. Actually, the very latest it can be in the cycle. So we're actually pushing up against the very end of the cycle. And that means we are definitely motivated to get all of those ballots counted and the canvas completed before we get to that Thanksgiving holiday. So I think that'll be good news for everyone. And
Margaret, to answer your question regarding independence, that May 90-day card is when, if you're an independent, those cards go out and you would elect if you want to participate in the Republican August primary or the Democrat August primary. And you need to fill that out and send it back, or go on to our website, beballotready.vote, because you're not automatically mailed a ballot for the primary if you are an independent, even if you're on the active early voting list.
Todd, if I might ask a question, the cards that are going to go out, you know, we in Maricopa County, a lot of folks use the Be Ballot Ready to find their voter ID card. Will that be available in time?
That's correct. Thanks for the question, Penny. We do have a fantastic voter dashboard that I think no one's paying attention to me when we have Ms. Duda here on screen with us, but we do have a fantastic customized voter dashboard called BeBallotReady.vote. You can get a copy of your ballot as well as your voter registration status. You can actually select from that website to receive an early ballot, a one-time request for an early ballot, all those types of information. So you no longer have to return that card to us. We do have two different cards actually that we send out at that 90-day notice. One is if you have a party, so that's just, and you're on the active early voting list, you'll get that. It's just confirming that you want that ballot sent to that current address. If you don't have a party, as Recorder Richard was mentioning, that's the pick a party. So if you are a P&D or an independent, then you need to tell us which ballot that you want for that August primary. And I want just one quick demonstration of our, let's see.
That's interesting. We have a jurisdictional option also. If you only want to, so we actually have 3 versions of the 90-day notice here in Pima County.
So there was a question about where you can go get this information. So on our website, so this is the Maricopa County Elections Department website. If you in Maricopa County, you can go down to our elections maps. And if you select this interactive reviewer, this is a wealth of information. We have lots of folks, once they find out about it, spend a lot of time. Slowly loading. If it will load. Should have loaded it earlier. But you can find using this all the current districts and historical districts. So this uses the Maricopa County's our GIS mapping system, and it has these drop-down boxes here. And if we wanted to go see, I mentioned the 2022 election precincts that are being considered by the Board of Supervisors. We can go and look at the current legislative districts and the current congressional districts that were drawn, and you can find and you can zoom all the way down to your address. You can even enter your address information up here. It'll take you to your house. And we have all the archived. So you can go back and look at voting precincts all the way back as far as 1998. You can look at all the Justice Court precincts, and then as well as prior legislative districts and congressional districts. So this is until we're able to upload all the information into our voter registration system and update our other online forms. This is the resource that voters can use to get their current legislative and congressional district information. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to turn it over to Gabby, and she can provide hers, and then we can answer questions, unless Penny, you want me to answer questions now.
So let's get Gabby to give us the Pima perspective, and then we can ask some of the broad questions that are being posed, okay? You're on, Recorder Casares Kelly.
Everyone knows how to make such nice PowerPoints.
I'm in awe of Scott's. Like, oh my gosh, what do I even have to share after Scott's super thorough presentation? Well, first of all, skuktash anya nyapchugi Gabriella Casares Kelly bismo ochkup amjun anyo word Pima chukshan ohahandam, which is really cool. I just actually learned how to say in Thanatham, I'm the Pima County Recorder because of the Maricopa County's website. They have such amazing resources there. And so I recently learned that. Chukshan Ohahandam. Pima County Recorder's Office is slightly different. I'm so sorry, I forgot to translate. I'm the Pima County Recorder. I'm from the communities of Bismo and Goop, which are located on the Thanatham Nation, which is right here in beautiful Pima County in the southern, southwestern part of Pima County. And so I don't know how that's showing up, if that's showing up in presentation mode. But we have very similar situation with, as Scott just shared in very detailed response, except in Pima County, the Recorder's Office and the Elections Department are completely separate. Of course, we collaborate, but the Elections Department is overseen by the Board of Supervisors and is accountable to the Board of Supervisors. We are collaborating right now with the county administration, the Elections Department, the GIS Department, and our office. And so we're big group project going on right now. And the Elections Department has been often asked to first go through and to the Elections Integrity Commission to seek their approval before anything goes to the Board of Supervisors. And so that's something that's been happening recently with a lot of the precinct changes. For us, you know, we are much smaller than Maricopa County. We have a population of about 1 million folks, registered voters 625, and then City of Tucson is our largest jurisdiction municipality here, and it's 286,000. And interestingly enough, they're the only jurisdiction within Pima County that usually holds their own elections. So they're about to have an election in May, which it causes a little bit of stress on our part, because we want to have that information available for people because of the precinct changes and all of that. We need to make sure that we get voter registration cards out in time and things like that. But they're holding their own jurisdiction. They mail out their ballots themselves. They assemble them themselves. Whereas Pima County, for every other jurisdiction, we do that. So the old, you know, what's changing, old congressional districts 1, 2, and 3 are changing to 6 and 7. So we have a disappearing congressional district, and old legislative districts 2, 3, 4, 9, 10, 11, and 14 are now 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and 23. And I do not know where I land in this at this moment. But this means that at least the district numbers will change for everyone. We have 29 new precincts created, 70 precinct boundaries were changed, and all of those, Scott gave a really wonderful explanation of the statutory requirements that we need to abide by, and that's what the Elections Department does. We don't have to do any of that here within the Recorder's Office. What we have been really concerned with is really about how we're sharing this information with the public. And so, of course, that is a new voter identification card. We're going to be mailing out 620,000 voter registration cards. And so we're working really hard to design them in a way that they're informative. So when people get them, they actually understand what all these numbers are, because they're very short. Or one situation that we really struggle with a lot here in Pima County is we have a lot of unincorporated land. So the City of Tucson has their boundaries, but anybody outside of the City of Tucson may still have a City of Tucson address. And so we'll get a lot of really angry phone calls from people outside of the city boundaries who are asking, where is my ballot? I want to vote. And so that's something that we're really struggling right now to communicate with the public, to make sure that they understand where their boundaries are. And so we're working right now with GIS, with the Elections Department, to try to have all of this information released on the same within the same couple of days so that there aren't any inconsistencies once this information goes public. And so I think we're looking at March 18th, I want to say, is the magic day. Am I right, Scott? And so that's really all I have to share. In addition, again, just to reiterate what Scott shared, we don't have as much say. We don't get to decide, and it is not our prerogative to decide those boundary lines. Pardon me, the redistricting. Our job is simply to process that information and relay that information to the public. And so, although I attended a couple of those Independent Redistricting Commission meetings here in Pima County, and I disagree with, as usual, I disagree with Recorder Richard. Because
Not
I
as
feel,
usual, not as usual. Come now.
yeah, we're like 10% of the time. But for me, as an Indigenous person, going to those meetings, sometimes, I would say something that the commission, we didn't take that into consideration. So like one of the things, for example, is just, it's such a silly concept. Of course, there are Native Americans that live on the reservations, but there are also Native Americans who live in cities and towns. And so it sounds ludicrous to have to bring that concept up, that there's a really large urban Native population. But that is something that has to be said because most people don't know enough information about us. And so having to go there and talk about that, I live in Tucson, unincorporated Pima County, almost close to Marana, in a predominantly white area, actually. And so, having to explain that I don't live on the reservation is like shocking to a lot of people. And so I feel that it's really important for people to get a better understanding of the community they're serving, to hear from the community. I do have some really sharp criticisms about the availability of those meetings, and that we, they were not in a lot of really accessible places, or, that they may be in a hotel conference room that maybe only housed 200 people and 600 people showed up. And so you're not able to sit and listen to what other people are saying to better your argument, or listen to some of the feedback and help draw those lines even. And so I have some thoughts on that. The other thing that we've been working on within the office, and we've been doing this for over a year, has been the housing split situation that Scott also shared. So Pima County had been using a street file. This is when you have directions that are something like, it's the northwest corner of Ina and Old Father to the boundary of Ina and Mona Lisa, or something like that. And of course, that creates those lines also. So we have been working to switch over to the GIS model and have those houses in independently listed areas, so that we're not dependent on those street lines that, if you've ever been to Tucson, they kind of curve all over the place. And so that's about it. Those are about, Scott, Stephen and I had kind of discussed this over the past couple of days, and we realized that we had duplicative information. So that is our updates from Pima County. And then the last one being that we are now moving to vote centers, just like Maricopa County, which is really wonderful. As we, I think it's such a great illustration of how confusing the precinct-based voting is. When you literally see it on the map, the middle of those houses are split right down the middle. And so the importance of that and the benefit to the community for vote centers that do not rely on those precinct designations. So that is also why we're so excited to have recently approved that here in Pima County. I'll stop there and we can stop for questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of our panelists this afternoon. We do have some questions that have been posed on our Q&A. And so let's see if we can get to a few
Eddie,
of those.
could I start
Kitty,
with
go
one
ahead.
question, please?
Yes.
If we could pick up from where Gabby just left off about vote centers. So Recorder Richard and Recorder Gabby, we have a reporter on the call, but I'm going to put you both on the spot. We have numerous legislation going through to put an end to vote centers, to put an end to access to the ballot. But let's talk about vote centers. We love vote centers in Maricopa County, and clearly you all start loving it in Pima too. So where do you, Recorder Richard, where we stand as the league on all of that legislation. We've been fighting it tooth and nail. But my question is, should any of that legislation pass, where do you see the work and the cost and the impact on the counties? We'd really like to have you speak to that, if you don't mind.
I think the cost increase would be considerable, among other things. So the reasons that we have embraced vote centers here, and this predates me, but is something that isn't my decision, but that I fully support, is because primarily, to Recorder Casares Kelly's point, it reduces voter confusion, it increases voter convenience. It also has the beneficial effect of decreasing provisional ballots, because the most common provisional ballot was somebody who showed up to the wrong precinct-based poll. As long as you show up anywhere in Maricopa County, you can get it. If you go up to Yavapai County, I'm sorry, we can't help you on that one. But we've got a pretty big geographic reach here, and so does Pima County. It creates a backup against system failures and long lines. And so we can all remember instances in Arizona's past where either a printer has gone down or a voting location hasn't opened for some reason. In a precinct-based polling model, I guess you have to sit outside until they fix the problem. In a voting center model, you can hopefully pull up the locations and travel maybe 5 to 10 minutes by car or less, and you can go get you can get your ballot printed there and vote conveniently there. It creates consistency across counties, which is important for us in that we're setting up the exact same thing in all of our voting locations. And we've had enormously positive voter feedback. But to your point, yes, it would increase costs considerably, because all of a sudden, instead of having 200 some voting locations, if we had to have one for, Scott just pulled up the number, what it was, 800 and some precincts, if we had to have one for every single one of those and the requisite poll workers for those, it would increase costs considerably.
It increases the cost because of the equipment, but also because of the personnel and then the number of people that you need to deploy. Even the addition of trucks to get all of the equipment to where it needs to go, all of that is just doubled, and there's no need for it.
Yeah, there's this notion that ballots were otherwise segregated prior to the transition to vote centers. That you could have easily identified all of the ballots that would be cast in that precinct if you had precinct-based polling exclusively. But that fails to take into account something that some of your commenters have mentioned, which is that the vast majority of votes are tabulated by mail ballot these days anyways. And so those are all already aggregated centrally and aren't sorted by precinct. And so, the idea that you could just sit there and tabulate every single person who showed up to the precinct-based poll and then check it against your precinct list of registrants is an antiquated notion, at least in terms of how Arizona does elections and has done elections for some time.
Mm-hmm. Good.
And it's also important to note that if anything were to pass the legislature this session, unless there was an emergency clause attached to it, it would not be in effect for this election cycle. It wouldn't go into effect until 2024. So, at that point, I'm sure it would have a lot of lawsuits because we do,
Okay.
we do love vote centers here in Arizona.
Eddie, do you want to take another question? There's some really good questions in here that we should bring up.
Yes. One earlier question was how many precincts in Maricopa County changed? And is that, can people review that? And I believe Director Jarrett did bring up an archive site so that you can look at the old precincts. But how many actually changed in the cycle? Do you have that number?
Yeah, so we had, counting the new precincts, a total of 387 changes.
Okay.
And that doesn't count the 135 that we made, the changes that we made back in September. So these are new, subsequent to the voting precincts that went into effect on January 2nd. Those were approved by the Board of Supervisors in late September. And then and just strictly because of the IRC's certification of the congressional district and the legislative district boundaries, 387 total changes.
Okay, thank you. And were there similar changes for Pima County, Recorder Casares Kelly?
Can I clarify something?
Yes.
Those changes aren't approved yet by the board. So I'll be presenting next week.
Mhm.
So they won't be in effect and approved until after the board approves.
Thank you. That's good to know. And
I
for
believe
Pima?
there was only 29 changes or something along those lines. And again, that's an elections department function, but I did want to point out that Mr. Duda wrote in the chat that he'll have to leave us. So if there's any
Yes.
questions directed for him.
Get your
Thank you.
Jeremy questions. Ask hard
Yes.
questions.
I have to go tend to the future voters here.
Well, that's very important. I don't see any questions immediately in the Q&A for him specifically. Penny, do you have any?
Yeah, I do.
Okay,
It's
good.
a question actually of the recorder, but I'm going to pose it to Jeremy. As our citizens are hearing, and we are all hearing from the recorders, we love vote centers, and there's a lawsuit essentially saying you can't have mail voting, no vote centers, no early voting, and then we have the legislature, in its infinite, in its small, minute, finite wisdom, deciding that we're going to take away all of that which we are used to and we benefit from in participating in this franchise. Any thoughts on that? Any advice to us as league members as to what we can do? We continue to speak up, as you know, and you quote us. So speak to that, Jeremy, and then we'll have the recorders weigh in.
Well, there's a difference between introducing a bill and passing a bill. There's a lot of legislation proposed in the Capitol this year to do a lot of things. I don't know which ones will pass and which ones won't, but I can tell you with pretty confident certainty that the legislature will not be getting rid of early voting and the legislature will not be getting rid of vote centers. There's at least a couple of Republican senators who are absolute, hardline no's on. I think we're getting rid of both of those. Paul Boyer told me at the beginning of the session, like, we were absolutely not getting rid of early voting. He's not the only one on his side of the aisle in either chamber. TJ Shope, Republican from Pinal County, told me, he's like, my county's been using vote centers for years and years and years, just getting a lot of attention now because Maricopa started doing it and people got up in arms. But, in other counties, rural counties have been using this, have had a good reason for using these for a long time. And he's very much a no. Boyer will be a no. Those two things are not going anywhere this year. As far as the rest of this stuff, we'll have to see, but a lot of the stuff that's coming more out of left field, I would not expect to see that going very far. Remember, the Republicans only have a 1-vote majority in each chamber. All the Democrats are opposed to this, and there are Republicans who are opposed to this, I think, in each chamber, and especially over in the Senate, where Paul Boyer can do whatever he wants with no political repercussions because he's not running for re-election anyway.
Recorder Richard, Recorder Casares Kelly, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the Republican legislators need to be just as concerned because this impacts their, like the the amount of people that are signed up for early voting, or the people who have done early voting, it's split across, the independents, Democrats, and Republicans equally. There's not one party that uses that service more than the other. And so it's just wildly popular. And I think we're at like 80% of Arizonans use some form of early voting throughout the state. It's incredible. But where it makes the most difference is in those rural communities, which a lot of times are often Republican strongholds. So it's just like shooting yourself in the foot. And it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so we're going to continue to advocate for access for all. Voting access should be nonpartisan. It should not ever be partisan. All of our elected leaders have a responsibility to continue to provide as much access to all constituents to the ballot box. I mean, that's a no-brainer.
Reporter Richard, do you want to weigh in on that too?
I agree with what was said. The irony is that there used to be a partisan skew a little bit, especially when originally introduced in Maricopa County, that this was introduced in 1991 by a Republican-led legislature. And prior to 2020, it was Republicans who used mail-in voting at a higher degree than Democrats. Not, both parties used it very significantly, but Republican Party did have the advantage. So that is the irony of this. I think the lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of all early voting, from what I've heard from the legal experts who have looked at this, it's unlikely, but we'll stay tuned. And obviously, if it's deemed unconstitutional, then the Arizona people would have to amend the Constitution if they so chose.
I'll chime in on that lawsuit real quick, since I spent some time last week talking to legal experts, and that is, it's quite a long shot argument. You have to keep in mind that the language they're relying on to claim that early voting violates the state constitution is not even in the part of the state constitution that is about elections and suffrage. It's in the legislative department in the section about initiatives and referenda, saying that the decision about those measures will be made by the people at the polls, which I think most people read as just not the framers of the Constitution not saying the voting on this has to be done in person at the polls, just describing it that way, just because that's how all voting was done back in 1910 when this was written. So it seems like quite the long shot. Okay, tortured reading of the law is the way one lawyer explained it to me.
Eddie, we're at 3:53. I think we should wrap up with our last two slides and let everybody have their Saturday evening back and family time with future voters, current voters, and everybody else. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen on the two items that you would like to present.
Yes.
And so,
thank you. And in the meantime, I will say that if your question was not answered, we will provide a follow-up answer to the questions that we were not able to get to. So we do want to call to action all of our voters to, one, be sure they are registered to vote, that their registration is in order. There are links here to find your new congressional district. You can do that on the IRC website. And soon, once the recorders have been able to update their systems, you can do it there, I'm sure. But there are two links here. You can also go to the IRC website to get more information in general about the new maps and the new districts. To check your voter registration, you can, both Maricopa and Pima County, of course, have that function on their websites. Many other counties refer their voters to a portal on the Secretary of State website. So that link is here. Anyone in the state can use this link. And there also, you should go to your county recorder and election departments to get election and voting information for your specific county. We think we have people from all over the state here, so we want to be sure you all know how to reach that. And of course, you would all be welcome to join the League as we continue to work for voter rights and election security and all of the other issues that we support. We welcome both men and women to our membership, despite our name. And so please check us out through the link that you see here. We will include all of these links in the follow-up email for attendees, so don't feel you have to quickly try to jot down all of this. You will get it in your inbox soon. So thank you very much. Thank you to all of our speakers. We really appreciate your time. As Penny pointed out, it's a Saturday afternoon. We are so grateful to you for giving us so much of your time on a weekend. And it's important to provide up-to-date, accurate information to our voters about the new maps, any new election procedures. And I know that all of you will continue your own education efforts to reach out to the public and let us know of the changes that have been put in place, as well as changes that are upcoming. So thank you all again very much for your time. Thank you to all of the attendees for attending and for your questions and for your interest in this important topic. So thank you all very much.
Well, with that, we will end the call. And if you would like to get those cards, I'm going to put it up on the screen again just once so you can see. Please write to us, and I'll put that in the chat at LWVAZ Advocacy, and we will try to get these cards to you. We anticipate having these cards in the public libraries. We also are asking cities to allow us to include this information in the water bill. So watch for it, folks. We want to get the word out so people know where to go to get the most reliable and trusted information. Thank you, county recorders, and Jeremy had to leave to take care of future voters. Thank you so much, Betty. I want to say a thank you to our Q&A moderators, Lynn Hudson, Leslie Cox, Betty D. Maitland, and Barb Rosenberg. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.